Let's talk a little bit about the tax policies that support what now seems to be a kind of, I would say, an integrated lifestyle. You know, there need to be sort of local industries and factories which support particularly the men, but increasingly the women from these suburban areas, and which then provide the goods that fuel the jobs that continue to fuel the factories.
Well, it's very interesting. The historian Andrew Highsmith has just completed a book about Flint, Michigan and its suburbs. And he shows that, in fact, in the 30s and even into the 40s, suburban communities were also redlined. And the way in which they got rid of or escaped their redline status was by the raising of monies through taxes and bonds to build things like sewers, new streets and lighting. And by the time you start to see the influx of families, there's a great demand for investment in schools and schooling. And so suburban taxes are some of the most fought over and debated taxes in all of the United States in these periods. And one of the ways in which suburban communities are able to afford high quality services for the veterans and the families moving in is through agreements and arrangements with industrial corporations. And so we see this in Oakland. The suburbs of Oakland take advantage of the presence of automobile plants and create 10 and 20-year policies that allow them to benefit by taxing those industrial concerns and putting that money towards city services and infrastructure. We see similar things on Long Island with the presence of the aerospace industry. However, there's a great deal of what we might call today opportunity hoarding. And so when metropolitan regions start to try, as Flint does in 1957, or as other large cities begin to try to do, either to annex these suburbs or to create regional government structures, suburbanites resist fiercely. And the arguments they make are arguments about choice. The people living there, they say, have chosen to live there, which of course ignores the ways in which their living there has been subsidized. And also, they make arguments about defending their families, that their money, their productive labor should go towards their specific families and their communities, not be spread widely across a metropolitan region. And so this kind of what Andrew Highsmith calls suburban capitalism becomes a feature of the creation of political units that allow suburbs to sort of benefit from the opportunities of post-war industrial and suburban development, but not so much bear the costs of, as you said, highway construction, slum clearance, and economic transformation.
So you're saying essentially that these suburbs are developed in some way by government policies which support the granting of mortgages to particular kinds of people, mostly veterans and so on, and that they produce a lifestyle in which families live fairly enclosed lives apart from close kin or generally apart from parents who would support them. And at the same time, they undermine with their tax structures the urban areas from which they come. So the two actually sort of push further and further apart. And I want to push now into saying, are we then saying that the value systems of the suburbs, which rest on consumption and individuality, are alien, become increasingly alien from the value systems of cities, which still rest on cooperation and collaboration just in order to live and thrive?
We might say that. The political scientist Margaret Weir has coined a term, the political geography of exit. She describes the suburbs as places where people can escape those communal bonds, the demands made upon you by your neighborhood, by your union. An interesting feature of the post-war suburbanization process is that while many of these men work in unionized industries, by the late 60s, when Gallup polls and other studies are done, they do not primarily identify as union members. This is not where they get their identity or their politics. They identify as homeowners and as suburbanites. And so their spatial location begins to take precedence over their occupational and vocational experience in their political and their social identities. Another interesting feature of the divergence you describe between city and suburb is that what is primarily an economic and a political divergence comes often to be seen as a cultural or behavioral divergence. And this leads suburbanites to resist fiercely when particularly African American and Latino city dwellers attempt to move to the suburbs. We have some images here from Chicago, a very famous and very violent riot in the industrial suburb of Cicero in 1951 that took place when a woman rented an apartment to a single black veteran. This kind of violence was often also couched in the language of protecting one's family, that the families of the suburbs were pure, were American, were proper, that the city was a place of juvenile delinquency, of danger, of degeneracy, and that those moving from the city to the suburb would carry with them some of this, if not kept out, often by popular violence, as well as by those more subtle administrative forms of segregation we talked about earlier.
So, and is this a black-white segregation, or are we now talking about more complicated forms of ethnicity?
The most well-known story of segregation in the United States in the post-war period is, of course, the story of the segregation of African Americans. But in cities and towns in California, there are already sizable Latino as well as Asian populations, and there are long histories of segregation of those communities there. In New York City, you've seen a massive influx of Puerto Ricans, first during the World War to provide workers for the war effort, but then afterwards. And so suburbanization, while it is deeply segregated along racial lines, is not exclusively black or white. There are many different processes at work here. Class as well. One of the other threats seen to suburbs is not just the demand for integration, but the demand for the creation of multi-unit housing. So suburban zoning laws become contested as efforts to build apartments in the suburbs are challenged in the courts and are rebuked by suburbanites who see that style of building as reminiscent of city living and all the threats they feel come with that.
It's fascinating. I want to take you one step further, which is to say these initial suburban communities, the Levittowns, are rather, relatively speaking, compact places, but very quickly, I believe, we move into what becomes known as exurbia. That is, people are no longer satisfied with the little plot of ground in the backyard, but the desire to have a bigger and better house and on an acre of land that exacerbates all of the tendencies of the suburbs. Am I right about that? Or?
It does, and this is a process that rolls on for decades. Today, in fact, we often talk about how inner ring suburbs, some of these first Levitt towns, are no longer wealthy. They're also no longer white in many cases, and in some cases they have higher poverty rates than the cities they surround. Meanwhile, you've seen gentrification in urban core areas, and you've also seen the creation of exurbs, large and very dispersed developments that sit far outside cities and are connected both by highways but also to industrial parks and other kinds of employment on the urban fringe.
As suburbanization spreads and we imagine the ideal lifestyle of the nuclear family that you say moves into the suburbs, we also know that in the 1950s we see the beginning of the rising divorce rates and the dissatisfaction that we later begin to understand or call the feminine mystique. I'd like to hold the suburbs responsible for this. Would you agree or would you not?
Well, I think it's similar to the cult of domesticity we talked about in the beginning of the course. It's an ideal, and much like the ideal of domesticity, which was realized only rarely in practice, or at least far less commonly in practice than it was imposed through the visions of things like Godey's Lady's Book, the suburban ideal of the nuclear family is never fully realized. And it has a great many tensions. We talked about the isolation that it visits upon women. It also requires that families stay together. Divorce challenges this. So for that matter, does misbehavior on the part of husbands, as well as the desire of women to see their lives expand beyond the development, to work, to act as citizens. All of these kinds of challenges to suburbanization start to feature in the movements of the late 50s and early 60s that we'll talk about further on.